Remember when opening a Tim Hortons donut box felt like Christmas morning? Picture this. You lift that familiar cardboard lid, and the sweet smell of cinnamon sugar and fresh glaze hits you instantly. Inside, there's a square Dutchie dotted with raisins, a chunky Walnut Crunch, and maybe even a twisted sugar stick waiting to be dunked. These weren't just snacks. They were Saturday hockey practice fuel, highway pit stop treasures, and the bribes that got your kids in the car for school runs. Tim Hortons launched in 1964 with just a handful of items, and some of these classics were there from day one. But here's the thing, most of them have quietly vanished from our double-doubles and coffee breaks. Tonight, we're cracking open the vault of 10 vanished Tim Hortons items only true Canadians remember. Which one still makes your mouth water? Let's dive in and find out. Let's start with the tiniest heartbreak, the Duchy Timbit. When Timbits launched in 1976, they weren't just donut holes, they were genius. Suddenly, you could taste every classic flavor in bite-sized form, perfect for sharing or sneaking an extra sweet without the guilt of a full donut. The Duchy Timbit brought all the nostalgia of the original 1964 Dutchie, those little bursts of raisin sweetness, the light glaze, that distinctly old-school Tim Hortons taste, in a package small enough to pop in your mouth between sips of coffee. Office meetings got better. Hockey team snack runs became legendary. You could buy a box of 20 and actually make them last more than one car ride. The Duchy Timbit was officially discontinued in 2014 during a massive menu cleanup that saw 24 items get the axe. Tim Hortons claimed they were making room for new innovations, but sometimes innovation feels a lot like loss. When you grabbed a mixed box of Timbits, that little square raisin nugget was often the first one you'd fish out, saving the glazed for last. Now it's just a memory in a box of safer, simpler flavors. Here's one that might surprise you. Tim Hortons used to make butter tarts. Real, honest-to-goodness Canadian butter tarts with pecans and that perfectly gooey filling that stuck to your teeth in the best way possible. The pecan butter tart represented Tim Hortons' ambitious side, back when they weren't afraid to venture beyond donuts and coffee. This wasn't just pastry, it was pure Canadiana in a flaky shell. In the 2014 Bring It Back anniversary campaign, the pecan butter tart was nominated as the representative treat of the 1980s, a decade when Tim Hortons was still experimenting, still trying to be more than just a donut shop. Imagine walking into your local Tim's after school and seeing actual butter tarts sitting in the display case next to the apple fritters. It felt fancy without being pretentious, homemade without being expensive, but complexity killed it. As Tim Hortons focused on speed and consistency, labor-intensive items like butter tarts couldn't survive the efficiency, demands of a drive-through culture. The pecans got messy. The filling required careful handling. The flaky pastry didn't travel well. So the pecan butter tart joined the graveyard of ambitious menu items that were too good for their own good. Okay, sweet tooth cooled? Let's talk soups and winter fuel. Picture this, a crusty round bread loaf, hollowed out and filled with steaming Tim Hortons chili or soup. The bread bowl wasn't just a container, it was part of the meal, designed to be torn apart and eaten, soaking up every last drop of that hearty chili. This was peak 2000 comfort food, perfect for hockey tournament weekends and snow day lunches when you needed something that would stick to your ribs for hours. The bread bowl made Tim Hortons feel like a proper restaurant rather than just a coffee shop, elevating a simple cup of soup into something approaching a feast. But bread bowls are labor-intensive nightmares for fast-service restaurants. Each one had to be individually hollowed out, creating waste and slowing down service during busy periods. They were inconsistent. Some bowls leaked, others were too thick or too thin. In the Instagram age, they were also remarkably unphotogenic, looking more like rustic peasant food than the sleek, shareable items modern customers expected. Speed, consistency, and visual appeal won over cozy comfort. and the bread bowl became another casualty of efficiency. If this brought back good memories, number 1 item will send you to nostalgia cloud 9. Number 7. Chocolate eclair. Now we're talking about real bakery drama, the chocolate eclair. Picture this: a long, elegant pastry split down the middle and stuffed with real whipped cream, then topped with a glossy chocolate glaze that caught the fluorescent lights just right. This was Tim Hortons flexing their pastry chef muscles back when they still had actual pastry chefs in the stores, but unfortunately, eclair was removed from the menu to make a way for newer items. But for a brief, beautiful moment in May 2014, Canadians could walk into Tim Hortons and order an eclair like it was 1967 again. But the comeback was short-lived because eclairs are high maintenance. They require skill to fill properly, careful handling to avoid breaking, and they don't have the shelf life of a simple glazed donut. In the modern Tim Hortons ecosystem, where speed and consistency rule everything, the eclair was a beautiful anachronism. It belonged to an era when your local Tim Hortons felt more like a neighborhood bakery and less like a fast food operation. The eclair represented craftsmanship in an age that was rapidly embracing efficiency. When it disappeared again after its brief resurrection, it took with it a little piece of Tim Hortons' artisanal soul. From bowls to cones? Yep, Tim's once scooped. For a brief, glorious period in the late 2000s, walking into certain Tim Hortons locations was like entering a parallel universe. There, next to the coffee urns and donut display, sat an honest-to-goodness ice cream counter, complete with mix-ins, frozen stone surfaces, and staff trained in the cold stone creamery method of theatrical ice cream preparation. This partnership was wild nostalgia for anyone who experienced it. The cognitive dissonance of ordering a double-double and a love-it-size cake batter ice cream in the same transaction. It represented Tim Hortons' brief flirtation with becoming more than Canada's coffee shop, a legitimate dessert destination that could compete with Dairy Queen and local ice cream parlors. The experiment didn't last long. By the early to mid-2000s, Tim Hortons was undergoing major strategic changes, including new ownership and a renewed focus on core competencies. The ice cream counters disappeared as quietly as they'd arrived, leaving only the memories of that surreal moment when you could get your Timbits and ice cream cake in the same place. The chocolate Danish was the blueberry Danish's indulgent cousin, all the same flaky pastry architecture, but filled with rich chocolate instead of fruit. If you were the kind of person who thought breakfast should be a little bit dessert, this was your jam, or rather, your chocolate. The chocolate Danish represented Tim Hortons' brief flirtation with being fancy, back when they thought Canadians might want something more complex than a Boston cream with their morning coffee. It had the same doomed fate as the blueberry version. But here's what they didn't account for. Sometimes people want their food experience to feel like a choice rather than a default. The chocolate Danish offered a different kind of morning ritual. Instead of grabbing the usual donut, you could pause, consider the display case, and select something that felt more intentional. It was a small luxury that made regular customers feel like they had sophisticated palates. When both Danishes disappeared, Tim Hortons lost a little bit of its bakery soul. Sure, they still had pastries, but nothing that required the same kind of craftsmanship or offered the same sense of European cafe culture. The chocolate Danish was a bridge between old-world baking and new-world convenience, and when that bridge got torn down, something essential was lost in translation. Every Tim Hortons had its apple fritter loyalists, but the real connoisseurs knew about the blueberry fritter. This wasn't just a fruit swap, it was a completely different experience. While apple fritters were chunky and substantial, blueberry fritters had this delicate sweetness that burst on your tongue with every bite. The blueberries would create little pockets of tartness against the sweet, craggy exterior, and when they were fresh from the fryer, those berries were practically molten with flavor. The blueberry fritter represented Tim Hortons' willingness to experiment within familiar formats. Instead of inventing entirely new pastries, they took something that worked, the fritter, and gave it a Canadian twist. Blueberries felt more local, more seasonal, more connected to actual fruit rather than processed filling. As Tim Hortons moved toward more centralized production and simplified preparation methods, labor-intensive items like the blueberry fritter became casualties. When it finally returned as part of the 2024 Retro Donuts campaign, the lines proved that some flavors never really leave our hearts, they just get temporarily discontinued from our menus. The cinnamon sugar twist was pure poetry in pastry form, literally twisted dough dusted with cinnamon sugar and designed specifically for dunking. This wasn't a donut you ate with your hands. This was a coffee companion, a sweet stirring stick that dissolved slowly into your double-double and made every sip a little more magical. Back in the 1970s, when the twist was a regular menu item, Tim Hortons customers understood the ritual. You'd order your coffee, grab a twist, and spend the next 10 minutes in a zen-like cycle of dip, sip, repeat. The cinnamon sugar would create little clouds of sweetness in your coffee, and the twisted shape meant it held together longer than a regular donut when subjected to repeated dunking. It was engineering and indulgence rolled into one perfect spiral. The cinnamon sugar twist disappeared because tastes changed. But when it returned as part of the 2024 Retro Revival, older customers practically wept with joy. Sometimes the simplest pleasures are the ones we miss most. The twist reminded us that not every food experience needs to be complicated. Sometimes you just want something sweet to make your coffee taste like childhood. The Walnut Crunch was Tim Hortons' answer to texture lovers everywhere. This stick-shaped chocolate cake donut came studded with actual walnut pieces that created little explosions of crunch in every bite. It wasn't pretty, honestly. It looked a bit like a chocolate log rolled in nuts, but it delivered on its promise in a way that few menu items ever have. The name told you exactly what you were getting, and what you were getting was perfect. Road trips weren't complete without a box that included at least one Walnut Crunch. There was something about the combination of soft chocolate cake, sweet glaze, and those nutty surprises that made long drives feel like adventures instead of obligations. It was substantial enough to feel like real food, but sweet enough to count as dessert. The Walnut Crunch represented Tim Hortons' willingness to prioritize substance over style, function over form. But like so many practical pleasures, it fell victim to menu rationalization in the mid-2000s. For years, it existed only in the memories of customers who would occasionally ask confused teenage employees if they still made that chocolate one with the nuts, only to receive the confused look. We saved the best and most significant for last. The Dutchie wasn't just a donut, it was a founding father of Canadian coffee culture. When Tim Horton and Jim Charade opened their first shop in Hamilton in 1964, they launched with exactly two donuts, the apple fritter and the Dutchie. While the apple fritter survived and thrived, the Dutchie became the Cain to its Abel, the equally worthy sibling that somehow got left behind by history. The Dutchie was distinctive in every way that mattered. Square instead of round, it stood out in every donut box like a geometric rebel. The raisins weren't just scattered randomly, they were distributed with the kind of care that suggested someone actually thought about how each bite would taste. The light sugar glaze provided sweetness without overwhelming the subtle yeast flavor underneath. This was a donut that respected its ingredients and respected your palate. What made the Dutchie's disappearance so heartbreaking was its pedigree. This wasn't some experimental flavor that failed to find an audience. This was literally one of the original two items that started the entire Tim Hortons empire. When Toronto newspapers polled readers about their favorite Tim Hortons items in the late 1980s, the Dutchie consistently ranked among the top choices. It had history, heritage, and a devoted following. But somewhere along the way, it slipped off the permanent menu, becoming a ghost that haunted the corners of Canadian coffee culture. If you enjoyed this trip down Tim Hortons memory lane, subscribe for more lost and found Canadian food history. We've got episodes planned on vanished McDonald's Canada items, discontinued chips that defined the 90s, and the rise and fall of regional Canadian restaurant chains that once ruled our strip malls and highway stops. Because sometimes the best way to understand where we're going is to remember where we've been, one discontinued donut at a time.